So let's just look briefly at Anselm's response to Gaunilo's response. And let me qualify everything I say here is that there's much more depth to the arguments here, which are very subtle and extensive, than I am able to get across. And certainly, in a week of looking at these things, the notion that we'll get everything specifically in mind to be comprehensive about it is a little bit unrealistic. But I would like to, just as I touched on a single point or two from Gaunilo's response, just to touch upon a point or two from Anselm's response to Gaunilo. One of the things we should acknowledge is that, first of all, he claims later, sort of further into, well into his response to Gaunilo, that he's been misquoted and misunderstood. That is, that Gaunilo has engaged in some loose characterizations of Anselm's argument by referring to a being greater than everything else, as opposed to Anselm's very specific wording of something than which nothing greater can be thought. Because that is actually quite important, because if we look at the argument, the something greater than which nothing can be thought, that wording is very key in order to arrive at the supposed logical contradiction that ends Anselm's argument, and supposedly establishes that the something than which nothing greater can be thought must exist both in the understanding and in reality. So that's quite important. But I would like to, follow up, and the way that I think that Anselm follows up on Gaunilo's point. Gaunilo seems to attack Anselm's argument at what he thinks is the weakest point, and that is the notion that we actually understand this expression, something than which nothing greater can be thought. And he wants to make this distinction between something being understood and something merely being thought. And that if something is merely thought and not understood, that is, we have a word in our mind that we're trying to find the meaning of, but we don't find the meaning of it, that would be very surprising were we able to find truth in that way, as he says. So I think that, amongst other things, that Anselm really has to reply to that. That is there a problem? He says, again, I'm sorry about page numbers, but this is about 2.5 pages into it. He says to Gaunilo, do you think the being about whom these things are understood can in any way be thought or understood, or can exist in thought or in the understanding? If it cannot, these claims about it cannot be understood either. Perhaps you will say that it is not understood and does not exist in the understanding because it is not fully understood. That seems to be kind of what Gaunilo was getting at. Understanding something would be a fuller thing than to merely think it. So merely thinking it is incomplete understanding. But then you would have to say that someone who cannot gaze directly upon the purest light of the sun does not see the light of day, which is nothing other than the light of the sun. Surely that than which a greater cannot be thought is understood and exists in the understanding, at least to the extent that these things about it are understood. Well, I mean, what is he pointing out there? That we are discussing this idea. Now, you, Gaunilo, are saying that saying certain things about this idea that than which nothing greater can be thought. And if we are discussing it, doesn't that mean that we understand it? I mean, we wouldn't be able to discuss it unless we understood it. Maybe it is that we don't. The claim is not that you fully understand God if you understand the thought that than which nothing greater can be thought. That's not the claim that Anselm is making. He would never claim that we can fully understand God, that we can know God, and fully understand even the concept of God, and on the basis of that, conclude that God exists because he's a necessary being. We merely have this thought, the something than which nothing greater can be thought. And if we understand that, which is a fairly narrow thought and a fairly limited and finite thought in a way, then his claim is, on the basis we can conclude that such a something must exist, because otherwise it wouldn't be that which than which nothing greater can be thought. So one of the things that Anselm seems to want to do is to deny the meaningfulness of this distinction between merely thinking something or thought and understanding something. He says a little bit lower than that, for when something is thought, it is thought by means of thinking. And what is thought by means of thinking exists in thinking just as it is in thought. And in the same way, when something is understood, it is understood by means of the understanding. And what is understood by means of the understanding exists in the understanding just as it is understood. What could be clearer than that? Seeming to suggest that this terminological distinction between thought and understanding is really not important. That is, that if something is understood, it exists in the understanding. If something is thought, it exists in thinking. And either way, then the first step of his argument, that this notion of the something than which nothing greater can be thought exists in thinking or in the understanding, so that then the next step can be made in the argument that it must also exist in reality. Just below what I just quoted from, paragraph I quoted from, and I think is a, this is good also because it forces Anselm to restate his argument, so it might be a chance for us to get a clear grasp of it. Just below that, he has a paragraph that says, after that, I said that if it exists only in the understanding, it can be thought to exist in reality as well, which is greater. Therefore, if it exists only in the understanding, the very same thing is both that than which a greater cannot be thought, and that than which a greater can be thought. This, again, is the key to his argument. Now I ask you, what could be more logical? For if it exists only in the understanding, can it not be thought to exist in reality as well? And if it can, does not the one who thinks it think something greater than that thing is, if it exists only in the understanding? So if that than which a greater cannot be thought exists only in the understanding, it is that than which a greater can be thought. What more logical conclusion could there be? But of course, that than which a greater cannot be thought is not the same in anyone's understanding as that than which a greater can be thought. Does it not follow, therefore, that if that than which a greater cannot be thought exists in any understanding at all, it does not exist only in the understanding? For if it exists only in the understanding, it is that than which a greater can be thought, which is absurd, which is to say, reminding us that the whole argument rests upon being led to a logical contradiction if one hypothesizes that the something than which nothing greater can be thought exists only in the understanding and not in reality. There's much more to this. I hope that you get more out of this than I was able to get across in these talks. Certainly I struggle, it's a very difficult argument. I think I may make one more video just to sort of put it in context, like why were we reading this? What have we learned? How can we connect it up with the previous things that we read? Maybe not. Maybe we'll leave that to the live session this weekend.